Hello, and welcome to the 24th episode of the Talos Principle. Last episode we cleared through the first of the stargates and collected all the sigils there. And this episode we shall do the same, but in the second world. Like the previous episode, this is post-commentary. And again, because I haven't actually gone through these sigils before, so some parts will be edited. Actually, the final sigil that I try to collect, I think is a better term, will be pretty heavily edited because it took a while. A recurring thing I've noticed, and I'm just checking this terminal to see if there's a specific text that I wanted to point out or talk about, but it wasn't there. A recurring thing for these star sigil puzzles I've noticed is that two of them will be relatively easy. At least I'm able to do them in 1, 2, maybe at most 3, I wouldn't say attempts since I'm not resetting the puzzle, but it just doesn't take too long. And then the third one, the final one, just seems to take the longest, either because I missed something crucial or it's just a bit difficult. So I'll be very interested to see what the final world sigil star door involves. On the bright side, this gold sigil puzzle here didn't take as long as the last one, but that's not all too relevant. What is relevant is the question of what am I going to talk about today. And I've been thinking a lot about the issue of scarcity recently. I've talked briefly in previous episodes about how humans aren't exactly built for the kind of abundance we have today in modern society. But what exactly is the issue of scarcity? You might have heard a few people among futurist or transhumanist circles talk about a post-scarcity society where the amount of resources available is so abundant that they cost practically nothing. Now, the YouTube channel Isaac Arthur has expanded on that idea and said that a post-scarcity society should also mean that nobody in that society has any issues getting mental help, have no issues with living a satisfied life, are never in any fear or worry or anxiety about the future. But that's not quite as far as I'll be going for the discussion today. What I want to talk about is basically just straight up physical resources. It's of my opinion that most of the world's suffering is due to scarcity. And I'm not saying that scarcity is like some well, I guess it is sort of abstract, but it's not this overarching one solution fits all thing like, say, the religious concept of original sin, where sin is this abstract concept and the solution is to plead to a deity for forgiveness. There's a lot of different ways that something can be scarce and a lot of different things that are scarce. And even more so, not everyone experiences the same kind of scarcity. Here in the United States, for example, we have water in such abundance, even in deserts, that we're able to use it for decoration. Outside of some buildings, they have water fountains, just masses of water flowing for the sake of aesthetic appeal without any real practical purpose. Meanwhile, in some African countries, water is so scarce that it's not even available most of the time to most of the people. People literally die because they don't have access to water. That's a very stark difference when it comes to scarcity and abundance, based strictly on geographical location. So when I talk about scarcity, just be aware that it's more complicated than a few sentences or an overarching slogan. It's not going to be like, say, the war on drugs, where the solution to all these different types of drugs was overwhelming police force and widespread criminality of it. It's going to require different solutions based on what is scarce. Now, I've read a very interesting book about the subject called Abundance, which goes over how some things that were once so scarce that they were worth their weight in gold even, through better knowledge and better technology, have become so abundant that not only can we use them for practical purposes whenever we please, but we can also just use them for superfluous purposes, even just for straight up aesthetic purposes. One of the biggest examples, and one so big that it actually was used on the cover of the book, was aluminum. You might be surprised to know that it was once scarce, but if there was a time when we didn't know how to, for lack of a better term, make it ourselves, we had to rely on very scarce natural pockets of it, and because of that, it was extremely valuable. In fact, there was even a story about a guy who did figure out how to synthesize it, and he was basically killed because it was worth so much that it would seem ludicrous to abandon such a valuable thing, make it practically worthless. But then you have the modern era where we use aluminum for everything from spaceships to wrapping sandwiches. Neither of which I think would be very welcome when it was still incredibly scarce. Another book I read, The Beginning of Infinity, by, I think it was David Deutsch, gave a story about how originally color television required this very scarce resource, some sort of crystal, and the author was talking to his professor at college about it, and the professor was pointing out that there's not enough of this resource in order to make colored televisions for everyone, and eventually they'll run out and only a few very elite people would have access to colored television because that specific resource is so valuable. But of course now we not only have color television, we have high definition, Blu-ray, and even now 3D television. And we've done that because we figured out a different way to make color television that doesn't rely strictly on that scarce resource. So there you have it, two very different examples of scarcity, one being a raw element and one being a technology that's incredibly difficult to make, both solved with better knowledge and better technology. But you can see why I'm so reluctant to try to say that scarcity in of itself it's a single thing that has to be solved and there's only one way to solve it, or there could be one way to solve it. Even just pointing out better technology and more knowledge, though more abstract than a specific solution, it still feels like cheating almost. Now, once things stop being scarce and start being abundant, they become a lot less valuable. One of the most famous cases in the history of technology is a computer. They used to be very difficult, very large, and quite honestly, very shitty. It used to be incredibly impractical to even have one, because why not just do all the calculations and everything else by hand? Why spend the modern day equivalent of millions of dollars on a machine that just isn't very good? But as we advanced in that technology and figured out how to make it better, and also figured out how to make more of it, it no longer had that same monetary value as it once has. Whatever you go to an Apple store or Windows store or whatever to buy is not only going to be far better than any computer from the first half of the 20th century, but it's also going to be a lot cheaper. And then of course there's the two other examples I mentioned, aluminum and colored television. Very cheap, especially relatively to what it was in the past, and also a lot better than it once was, now that we're not exactly relying on natural deposits of it for aluminum, or a very rare resource for colored television. Oh, by the way, you can kind of see how I solve this here. Eventually I've realized that you have to sort of backtrack. So right now I'm trying to find a good angle to attach the blue source to the blue gate, and here we go. Now, one thing I've noticed that proponents of post-scarcity societies often think about or imagine when they sort of dream about this future without limited resources is that the entire world will be post-scarcity. When you see I kind of messed up there. I didn't realize there was a second gate here. But they tend to imagine that the whole world will be a post-scarcity society, and that's sort of utopic thinking I want people to be cautious about. Think about how much food you've thrown away in your life up to this point if you live in the United States or Europe. You've probably thrown away quite a lot. I've thrown away quite a lot. it's not a rare resource, but it is in quite a few countries. Whatever food I had that I threw away, there's basically no chance that it would ever reach the mouth of some starving African child. The fact that it's abundant in one place does not necessitate that it will be abundant everywhere else. That will require something a bit more than just better technology and better knowledge. That will require a more empathetic society, or a more globalized society, perhaps. Or perhaps for other societies to be more active within the global community. The problem is, if you're in a country where the majority of your population isn't able to access things as basic as food and water, then chances are you don't really have a lot of things that would be very useful to any other country that would make them want to get involved in your country and, start trading things. That's an issue, I think, of economics more than technology and knowledge, is what I'm trying to say here. And it's something that I've talked about before, like the issues that could crop up with transhumanism as far as bodily autonomy and personal rights goes. It can't exactly be solved by just better technology. It will require a better society. So then let's, just for the sake of argument, assume that only one country becomes post-scarcity. Maybe Sweden gets really lucky and figures out how to make any element or any machine so easy and so cheap that it's worth practically nothing from then on. One of the worries about such a future where things are no longer valuable like that, and also futures where, say, robots do all the work and we no longer have to do manual labor or any sort of labor for that matter. Just all these really far out futures is that people will no longer have any incentive to do anything. Personally, I disagree very strongly with that sentiment. There's plenty of cases in history where there's these really rich people in society who, for all intents and purposes, could just do absolutely nothing with their lives and just enjoy the wealth and luxury their family was able to provide, and yet they've still gone out and gone through the struggle of improving upon human knowledge or human society. Now, maybe some people will just loaf around doing nothing with their lives and just be a waste of resources, though those resources aren't exactly going to be scarce by any means. But there are still people like that even today in a world plagued by scarcity, so it's, well, if nothing else, it will just be a continuation of an issue that already exists and not one that is necessarily created by a post-scarcity future. But I don't think that a post-scarcity future would be a lazy one, which is what I'm trying to say here. Another worry people have is whether or not things would have value in a post-scarcity future. Like, already the premise is that resources are so abundant, they're practically free. So would art have a value in a future where you can, let's hypothetically say, put in a replicator and make an unlimited amount of whatever that art is? I'd be inclined to say yes, if for no other reason. That art isn't just going to appear out of thin air. It will still take a human being or a machine to make, and as long as it still takes that, people are going to find value in just the straight up labor needed. The time and practice, or maybe just downloaded knowledge, creativity. In a post-scarcity future, the one that I'm talking about, the more limited one than, as I've mentioned, Isaac Arthur mentioned, if it's just resources that are scarce, resources and technology and machines, and there's still going to be plenty of room for more abstract stuff like knowledge and creativity and innovation. So I don't think a post-scarcity future will be a valueless one either. Actually, something I just thought of for the first issue, wouldn't people just sit around being lazy and not doing anything at all? In addition to the fact that even today in a scarcity-ridden present, there's people loafing around doing nothing, there's people doing all these incredible things absolutely for free. People who put so many hours and investment in a project for what's essentially just exposure for bragging rights. It's a pretty common joke among artists online that the worst clients will try to pay you in exposure, because how exposure doesn't exactly put bread on a table, but in a post-scarcity society where getting food isn't exactly a huge issue, I think people will more and more veer toward, I want my work to be exposed to as many people as it possibly can, rather than strictly, I want it to make as much money as it possibly can. There's stuff like the whole speedrunning community where people, again, put hours and hours of time and investment into what's essentially just bragging rights. I've managed to get through this video game faster than any other human being in history. It's not necessarily a very valuable thing, sure, but look how proud I was of solving a puzzle in a video game. But it still shows that fact that people, even without monetary value, are still driven to do great things. Whether it's something that might seem mundane, like going through a video game quickly, or something that's a huge aspect of a culture, like making art or music or entertainment. I mean, even here, I'm not making any money playing through this video game and giving these little rambling talks about all these futurist subjects. And while it may not exactly be a super valuable output, it still is an example of someone doing something for free simply because he likes it and wants people to be exposed to it. Now, how we exactly get to a post-scarcity society, I honestly don't even know where to begin. And it's not just because the time of this video is running out, but there's a universe filled with resources, and of course, the better technology, the more knowledge we get, the less of those resources we'll have to actually use for one thing or another. It's what the entire history of scarcity and abundance is why things like the fact we're not able to mass-produce carbon nanotubes, stuff that's basically strong enough to build space elevators at a massive scale yet doesn't bother me, because as far as I'm concerned, that last word, yet, is the big picture here. I do think that with more work on technology and the sciences, we will eventually figure out how to make all these formerly scarce things super abundant for us and reap the benefits that would come with it. And I do think that if we are very active with trying to make a better society, that more and more people will be able to hold this benefit. How long that'll be, I don't know. It could be a few decades, it could be a few centuries. And new problems, of course, will always crop up. But until that happens, that's my little rambling lecture on scarcity, various subjects and criticisms of it. I hope I gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.